Hello and welcome to this online talk about the context between the Mycenaean world and in particular Mycenae, the citadel that you see here in the background, and other regions in the eastern Mediterranean and Europe during the late Bronze Age, the period between 1600 and about 1100 BC. We know from archaeological finds and contemporary texts that this was a period of unprecedented contact. And we know that kings and queens engaged in diplomatic missions, diplomatic trade, they exchanged prestige goods, think of silver or gold objects, or copper and tin ingots necessary to create bronze, hence the Bronze Age. We know that they exchanged other objects such as exotic animals or plants. And there's evidence for the introduction of the olive in Egypt as a result of contacts with the Mycenaean world. Today I will be talking especially about things that are not all that easily recognized in the archaeological record, and that is about the spread of tales from especially the Near East, in particular Egypt, to the Greek world. And I will be arguing that it was a group that has hitherto been largely overlooked in the historical debate, namely mercenaries, that these mercenaries were especially responsible for the spread of these tales. I hope that you enjoyed this talk. My name is Jorrit Kelder. I work for the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and I'm an associate at the Oriental Institute of Oxford in the UK. So for clarity's sake, I have jotted down the main arguments and the structure of today's lecture here on this site. And I will focus straight away on point one, the so-called Uluburun ship, a reconstruction of which you can see here in the background. Few sites illustrate the close relations between the Aegean, Cyprus, the Levant and Egypt, as well as that shipwreck of Uluburun. The ship, measuring some 20 meters or so, was probably of Levantine build and was on its way to the north when it sank at some point around 1305 BC, if we may believe the dendrochronological data. Its cargo was preserved on the Bay of Antalya, providing us with a unique insight into the complexity of late Bronze Age long-distance exchange and the sheer scale and variety of objects and materials that were transported. Apart from a whopping 10 tons in copper oxide, bun-shaped and oval ingots, the ship carried Canaanite vessels, holding amongst others, it seems, pistachio resins, glass ingots of uncertain but possibly Egyptian origin, ebony and ivory, silver and golden jewelry from Egypt and the Levant, and a smaller group of objects that came from the Aegean world, including some 18 stirrup jars and a flask, as well as 2 Mycenaean-type swords, razor blades, and 2 glass relief plaques that I thought to have been part of 2 pectorals. Cemal Pulak, the excavator of the site, has proposed that these were the personal effects of 2 high-ranking Mycenaeans, possibly acting as emissaries on behalf of a Mycenaean king. And whilst this must remain conjecture, the cargo of the ship, and you can see a cut through here, does indeed resemble many of the items that are listed in the Amarna texts as part of diplomatic gift exchange. What may lend further credibility to Pulak's suggestion is the presence of a remarkable diptych at the site. The materiality of this folded writing board, made of choice boxwood and ivory, the hinges, you see a picture here and a reconstruction drawing of it, the hinges were made of ivory, suggests that it was more than merely a trader's log, and in my view it is most plausibly interpreted as a diplomatic passport, perhaps including a list of gifts that were to be presented at court, and we know of such gifts and lists from the Amarna archive in Egypt. This of course does not necessarily make its bearer Mycenaean, though it should be noted that some of the signs, and you see them here on the side of one of the writing tabs, that some of these signs are very reminiscent of Mycenaean numerals. They're not identical, but very similar. It does seem reasonable to assume with Pulak that the Uluburun ship was indeed laden with diplomatic gifts, destined for one of the palatial centers in the Mycenaean world, and that at least 2 of its passengers were Mycenaean diplomats, escorting their precious cargo. The voyage to and from the Levant, or even further south to Egypt, was not without its risks, and indeed the very fact that the Uluburun ship sank clearly demonstrates the perils of such maritime travel, and we see a picture here, including a little picture of the diptych again, of the trade routes of the time, with also the spot where the Uluburun wreck was found is indicated here with a little ship. But apart from bad weather, human factors could also imperil the late Bronze Age traveller. And there is ample evidence for this in contemporary texts, where we find references to rulers detaining foreign diplomats, trade embargoes prohibiting ships from entering port, and, far more frequently, piracy. The messengers on board of the Uluburun ship may have prepared for such eventualities. Both appear to have worn swords, and they may have even had their own personal escort. It was again Cemal Pulak who had suggested that a remarkable stone mace head, of a type known from the Carpathian region, and that was found amidst the Uluburun wreckage, may have been one of the attributes of a clearly important northerner. Several other objects, including a particular type of dress pin, a bronze sword with central Mediterranean but also Balkan parallels, and various spearheads of a type that were common in Macedonia, and you see an example here, may have also belonged to this person, or perhaps even to several persons, several northerners, because we have several spearheads. Whilst this northerner may have been on board for his own reasons, one might also, and perhaps more plausibly, suggest that he was a member of the Mycenaean cortege. Heavily armed, he could have served as their bodyguard, though the presence of that stone macehead that you've seen just a minute ago might also be more plausibly suggest that he served as a sort of a ceremonial capacity as a mace bearer, announcing the arrival of and instilling awe for his Mycenaean companions. Could we thus be dealing with a mercenary from the edges of the Mycenaean palatial world? It is worth noting that, although the Bronze Age in the Balkans to a large extent remains an archaeological terra incognita, recent research suggests that the regions to the north of Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, especially the Carpathian Basin, were far more involved in the Mediterranean world than hitherto been thought. Though the precise nature of their relation with the Mycenaean world remains unclear, one can reasonably be sure that Mycenaean demand for metals played an important role in these connections. The Carpathians are rich in gold, silver and copper, and there is good evidence for extensive mining and metalworking in the region during the late Bronze Age. And you can see the skill of the metalworks in that area here. This is the so-called Valchitrun treasure, which is now on show in Bulgaria, in Sofia, and it testifies to the amazing skills of the workmen in Bulgaria in this case at that point in time. In exchange for metals and finished objects, for the skills of the Carpathian smiths were considerable, and we've just seen that with the Valchitran treasure, as well as objects and materials such as perhaps amber from regions further to the north, from the Scania area in southern Scandinavia. Aegean traders may have provided their Carpathian neighbors with access to materials and objects from the Mediterranean, the Near East and beyond. And I've plotted some of the objects that were traded here on a map, and it sort of shows the respective trade routes of the time. Now it is important, and I will come back to this later on, that with trade obviously also came knowledge, and we can see, for example, from the spread of certain types of swords, for which you actually need to know what you're doing. You need to be a really good blacksmith or swordsmith in order to make such things, such as the so-called APA swords that you see here today. Now, from the very swift distribution of these specific types of swords throughout Europe, and then especially in the Carpathian Basin, the Aegean and Scandinavia, but now also, for example, in southern Germany, two of these APA swords, or very similar swords, have been found with the so-called Nebra sky disc, which you see here. We can see how intense the connections were, not just in the Eastern Mediterranean, we knew that from texts, but also in Europe itself. In sum, it is perfectly plausible to assume that the Mycenaean elites employed foreign mercenaries from the Balkan. And the Mycenaeans would not have been alone in their practice to employ foreigners in the army, for the tradition was by the 14th century BC already well established throughout the Near East, and we have plenty of textual evidence and even some archaeological evidence for the employment of mercenaries from especially, say, the periphery, the Barbarian periphery. This is traditionally throughout history, even into Roman and later times, the area where people would get their mercenaries, their military specialists from. And we have got lots of evidence for the employment of such people within imperial armies. Egypt, for example, and we see a picture here of some of these examples, had a long tradition of incorporating foreign specialists in its army. The best known example for this practice surely is the inclusion of Nubian archers in Egyptian armies, and we see a model from the, I believe, Middle Kingdom here in the lower left corner of the slide. but other cores such as the Magi, also a Nubian tribe who were used to patrol desert routes, were also incorporated in the Egyptian armor, as were, for example, Libyans, Canaanites, and so-called Shurden. And you see them in the right top corner, where they serve as the bodyguard of Ramesses II. This is a relief from his temple in Abu Simbel in the south of Egypt. These Shurden are mostly known from texts dating to the end of the Bronze Age, when they were part of invading sea peoples, a collection of various peoples whose origins are still unclear, but who seem to have coalesced, at least occasionally, into larger sea-borne raiding parties. It remains unclear as to how most of these foreigners entered the Egyptian army, though in the case of the Shurden, and we see a reconstruction of a Shurden warrior here, the texts indicate that they were forced into service following their defeat at the hand of the Egyptians. Whilst the precise terms of their employment in Egypt elude us, it is clear that numerous Shurden never left the land of the Nile, and instead they settled down, acquired land, presumably in payment for their military service, started a family, and to a remarkable extent Egyptianized. Nevertheless, there is evidence that they retained some of their own cultural peculiarities, and a century after their first appearance in Egypt, early in the reign of Ramesses II, they still stood out from the normal average Egyptian. Papyri from the reign of Ramesses V and Ramesses IX still identify Shurden amongst the Egyptian population, and in particular at the site of Gurob. Now there is some good evidence to support the notion of Shurden settling at this particular site just south of Cairo. You see it here on this satellite image. Petrie, a famous Egyptologist at the beginning of the 20th century, during his excavations at Gurob, was struck by the amount of especially Mycenaean imports at the site, as well as a number of peculiar features, most notably various groups of burnt objects that, he suggested, might betray northern Aegean cremation customs at the site. This suggestion has recently been questioned, rightly I think, and Petrie's so-called burnt groups may now be more plausibly be identified as the remains of looted grave inventories, probably dating to the Third Intermediate Period, and the burning might be explained as a rather crude attempt by the looters to extract anything of metal from these objects. Although Petrie's argument for a Mycenaean tradition of cremation at Gurob thus seems questionable, various other finds at Gurob do suggest a foreign presence at the site, and this includes the occurrence of non-Egyptian names on funerary stelae, but more importantly and spectacularly, it also includes the remains of a wooden model of a ship. Petrie, when he discovered the remains of this model, assumed that it represented an Egyptian barge, and you see his original reconstruction on the black and white picture in the left upper corner. But a recent study by Shelley Waxman has now shown this to be wrong, and instead he notes the remains represent a land-based cultic ship cart that had been patterned after an actual ship, in this case a pentaconter. Put simply, the Gurob model is a copy of a copy. And while the Gurob model was thus twice removed from the original war galley that served as its prototype, the information that the model supplies regarding the transfer of cults in the seam between the Late Bronze Age and Iron Ages cannot be overemphasized. End quotation. What we have here then is a piece of remarkable religious syncretism, for whilst models of barges, usually carried on long poles by priests in Egypt, were known for religious processions, the model from Gurob shows a completely novel, alien type of ship, that in Egypt at least is clearly associated with the sea people and the Shurden in particular. As such, the Gurob ship does not only serve as an example of religious syncretism, but also demonstrates the role of foreigners, in this case Shurden, in the transfer of military naval technology. In a series of important publications, Jeffrey Emanuel, an archaeologist at Harvard, has demonstrated the importance of the sea people as a catalyst for maritime technological innovation. Whilst various novel technologies, such as the loose-footed brailed sail and the top-mounted crow's nest, were already known in the Levant and through trading contacts with that region, also in Egypt, during the 18th dynasty, it appears that their full military potential, especially in combination with the new Aegean type of war galley, such as the ship of Gurob, was first realized by groups such as the Shurden. And it is only after encountering the first groups of sea people, early in the reign of Ramesses II, that Egyptian shipwrights took notice of the sheer value of this complete technological package and started implementing it in their own designs. The change can be traced, as Emmanuel has shown, in various Egyptian reliefs of the 19th dynasty. And whilst Egyptian ships during Ramesses II's first encounters with the Sheridan are typically Egyptian, and you see a model of a typical Egyptian ship, a seaworthy ship here in the background, those that are deployed by Ramesses III, as shown on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, whilst still based on Egyptian riverine ships, rather than the Aegean galley, are otherwise remarkably similar to the ships of their foes, with a top-mounted crow's nest and a loose-footed brailed sail. Thus, the arrival of the Sea People, despite the havoc that they wrought, is also associated with a number of remarkable breakthroughs in the field of maritime technology that, in many ways, stood at the basis of the shipbuilding traditions in Greece and Phoenicia during the millennium to come. It thus seems reasonable to assume that mercenaries were important actors in the transfer of military technology, tying the peripheries of the ancient world to the core of civilized urban societies. And of course, this process of transfer usually went two ways. Think of, for example, of the appearance of plate armor in temperate Europe during the 13th century BC, and the appearance of the Nawatou sword in Greece around the same time. And indeed our northern mercenary on board of the Uluburun ship may have been one of the actors that facilitated this transfer of technology between the Aegean and the Balkan. Mycenaean Greece, in our view of course, was not part of the barbarian periphery. It was dotted with palatial centers, which were home to a literate palatial elite. And from Hittite texts, such as the one you see here, we know that Mycenaean rulers were involved in high-level diplomacy, that they participated in royal gift exchange and personally knew high-born Hittite officers. And in this text, the so-called Tawagalawa letter, it refers to a certain Tawagalawa, which is probably the Hittite rendering of the Greek name Eteocles, who is the brother of the king of Achiawa, which is Achaia, and who reportedly rode together with the personal charioteer of the Hittite king. So we're talking about elites that really knew each other on a personal level. But despite being a more or less fully integrated part of the civilized Eastern Mediterranean world, it appears that Greece was a source of military expertise and troops too. And a sword that was captured during the Hittite campaign against the so-called Ashua League of Western Anatolia, for example, and you see the sword here in the top, is of clearly Aegean-inspired type. We know similar swords from Mycenaean Greece, even though its dedicatory inscription, which you see here magnified below, indicates that it was used by a soldier of and probably forged in Ashua in western Turkey. Similarly, there are good indications that Mycenaeans served in Pharaoh's armies from at least the Amarna period onwards. So that's roughly the same time. And the famous pictorial papyrus found at Akhetaten, which you see here in the lower right corner, offers a rare glimpse of these Aegeans, wearing their boar tusks helmets, but otherwise dressed like Egyptians. You see them here in action. Archaeology offers some additional evidence in the form of a piece of just such a boar tusk helmet that was found at the site of Pyramesse in the northern delta of Egypt. And of course the Gurub ship model, which you see a reconstruction of here, may similarly hint at a Mycenaean or at the very least northern presence, even though the origins of the Sheridan remain a bit murky. But the ship is, of course, as Waxman already said, of a very Aegean type. It's the prototype of the later Greek war galley. And that is not all, because both Emmanuel and Waxman have already pointed out that the red and black paint of this model, which you see very clearly here in this reconstruction, is so idiosyncratic that it really stands out, and its most likely parallel are the ships of the Achaeans, of the Greeks, in the Iliad, and then specifically the contingent of ships from Ithaca under the leadership of Odysseus. All the Greek ships are black-bellied because they were tarred at the back to make them watertight, but only Odysseus' ship have a red or purplish kind of stripe along their cheeks, just like the model that we know from Gurub. It is likely that, like Odysseus, at least some of these Mycenaean mercenaries entered Egyptian service voluntary, or at the very least were able to leave Egypt after their period of service ended. And the rare find of a piece of scale armor, of a type worn by Near Eastern charioteers, and stamped with the cartouche, the name of Ramesses II, which was found at the island of Salamis, just off the coast of Athens, may have belonged to one of these returning soldiers. Even though the Late Bronze Age was a period of unprecedented mobility and connectivity, there can be no doubt that these returning warriors were held in high regard and had a special status in their community. Apart from bringing souvenirs, such as the piece of scale armor with them, they doubtlessly told stories about their past experiences in distant lands. And these stories, of course, were carried with fantastic elements, with hearsay and with pure fantasy. But, like their practical knowledge of foreign techniques and customs, they also served as a conduit for literary topoi, for elements of tales, larger tales. And the remarkable parallel between the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep II, which you see here, who showed off his military prowess by shooting arrows through copper ingots. You see here the ingot in the lower right corner, and the pharaoh in his chariot. And Odysseus' ability to shoot an arrow through a row of 12 axes, which you see here on this later Greek skyphos, on a little pot, may well be seen through the prism of such storytelling, whereby an original Egyptian topos was transferred to Greek epic. Odysseus in particular, and you see this on the slide, seems to have had quite a few Egyptian-inspired tricks up his sleeve. For apart from his abilities with his bow, his famous trick with the Trojan horse is remarkably similar to the Egyptian story of General Jehuti, who served under Thutmose III and is reported, in a papyrus now located in the British Museum, to have captured the enemy city of Joppa by concealing his soldiers in large baskets, and then by offering these baskets, professing them to be full of tribute, to the ruler of the city. And we all know what happened there, at least the Trojans knew. Not all of these literary elements need to have come to Greece via returning mercenaries, of course, though it would make perfect sense for precisely this type of specialist to be familiar with heroic stories, perhaps sung to them by their foreign comrades at the campfire, and to integrate these stories in their own songs of glory and fame. So what I'd like to propose is that the similarities between Near Eastern stories about, well, Gilgamesh, we haven't talked about him today, but about Jehuti, or Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, and the Greek epic cycle, and eventually even Northern European epics, such as the Songs of Beowulf, should perhaps be seen in the context of these late Bronze Age military connections. I would suggest that the merging of these stories from various parts of the Eastern Mediterranean world, and probably even from Europe, during the final years of the late Bronze Age, contributed to a new emerging sense of identity amongst certain groups, mercenaries, military specialists, later known basically as heroes and immortalized, for example, in the poems of Homer, whom we see here. And one way to identify as such a hero and to be commemorated as such a hero is, of course, in the ultimate final act of every story, in death and burial. And it is perhaps striking that precisely these aspects, the burial of, for example, the Homeric heroes, think of Achilles or Hector, owes more than its fair share to, for example, late Bronze Age Hittite royal funerary customs. And we know from texts from the Hittite Empire quite precisely how these... This is quite interesting, for at the same time in the late Bronze Age, in the Mycenaean world, cremation was not the rule, and kings were normally buried under magnificent tholoi in earlier Mycenaean times, around 1600 BC. We know of the shaft graves at Mycenae. You see a stele here in the left upper corner, but from the 14th century at the latest onwards, Mycenaean elites normally were buried in these magnificent tholos tombs, the beehive-shaped tombs. Only towards the very end of the Mycenaean palatial era, around 1200, do we gradually see cremation becoming more of a regular feature in the Mycenaean funerary record. And what you see here in the lower right corner is a site near Mycenae called Chania, dating to the final decades of the 13th and 12th century BC, so the very end of the Mycenaean palaces and the period thereafter, which was used as a site for cremation burials, covered after that by heaps of earth to make a tumulus. Even though the palaces disappeared around 1200 BC, the tales about the palaces and the world of the palaces did obviously not. And if only through Homer we know that they were sung and sung again through the ages, right into the classical period. And with those songs, the idea of what it meant to be a hero, what it meant to be a powerful lord, sort of continued to be heard and continued to be acted upon. And thus we see the way of heroic Homeric burial spread not only in Turkey, where we already had the Hittite way of dealing with the dead, but also across Iron Age Europe. And what we see here in the background is the royal necropolis of Sardis, of the Lydian kings in the 6th century BC. But in the top right corner, for example, we see a very similar looking burial with about 100 meters in diameter, a tumulus with a cremation burial in precious metal vases and buried with a sword and the bones wrapped in this case, a martenpelt from a site called Sedin near Berlin in the Prignitz in eastern Germany, dated to about 800 BC. The idea of what it meant to be a hero, the idea that was formed I think, in the late Bronze Age, in the final decades at least of the late Bronze Age, thus seems to have continued and to spread across the communities of Iron Age Europe and indeed of Turkey. And with that, I finally come to the end of this talk. I would argue that mercenaries and military specialists in the late Bronze Age were not only responsible for the transfer of military know-how, of technology, but also shaped in many ways a new ideology of what it meant to be important, what it meant to be a hero, and how one should manifest himself if one wanted to live by this standard. And that contribution, I think, quite apart of course from its literary merits, continued to endure well into the Iron Age and shaped in many ways the later Greek idea of death and a noble life, as for example is represented here on this beautiful Dipylon vase from geometric Athens. I very much hope that you enjoyed this talk. Feedback, as always, is welcome in the comments below this lecture, and I hope to see you again soon.